The question of how a good God could allow evil in his world has bothered people since ancient times. Today we have that same question thrown to us in the book of Esther, when we have a very evil circumstance and the Jewish people were wondering, where is God? How could he allow such a great evil? And today, Steve, we're going to see that God has a purpose for what he does, and nothing falls outside of his control. And so he's got an answer to their question. It's just he doesn't always reveal it immediately.
And that's how we can live our life, is knowing that God always has an answer and that God is always working behind the scenes. And as you have so aptly put in all of our sessions so far, God has a solution before a problem even comes about. We should be bolstered and encouraged by knowing that, and that we should keep that forefront in our mind. God's always got a solution before we even know that there's a problem.
The difficult part is he doesn't always tell us what his plans are, and we have to wonder and trust him. And so sometimes these things are faith-building exercises. But we're reasoning through the Old Testament book of Esther. If you have your copy of the Word of God, turn to Esther chapter 4. And so far in our story, we have Esther and Mordecai, these two cousins that were Jewish. And through God's hand of providence, Esther has become queen. She has kept her heritage secret, so no one knows in the palace that she is of Jewish descent. Meanwhile, an evil man, Haman, has bribed the king to kill all the Jewish people, and they've declared a date that is a few months out. And so now we're going to see, as we left last time, the city is in turmoil, and the leaders are disconnected from that because they're just in their palace and insulated from it. Meanwhile, now we're going to see how the Jewish people react. We're going to see how the Jewish people react. So, Steve, if you could read in Esther chapter 4, the first 3 verses.
When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. He went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. In each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes.
It says here that Mordecai is in mourning. The sackcloth and ashes, sackcloth, very rough fabric, not like clothes that you'd wear on any normal basis. So he's showing, I'm debased. I'm undone is one of the words that gets used in the Bible. He's showing I'm so stressed that life is overwhelming now. And so he's put on rough clothing and he's pouring dirt and ashes on his head. And it says in the end of verse 1, he wailed loudly and bitterly. And he did that throughout the city as he went up to the king's gate. So this is a very public area. The king's gate would have been very busy, a lot of activity there, things going on. So he's wailing loudly and bitterly and putting ashes on his head, and he's doing it all through the whole city. This would have been very noticeable, of course. It was also a little embarrassing, but he doesn't seem to care at this point. Why would he not care what other people thought of him?
Because his life and the life of his people are on the line. When you get into that type of a situation, you throw all embarrassment and protocol and everything else behind you. He is trying to get the attention of the people, and really he's trying to get the attention of the king, because it's the king's decree of how serious the situation is.
It says here in verse 3, look at verse 3, in each and every province where the command of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, with sackcloth and ashes. So this was very public, going on in every city by many of the Jews. So very public display of distress. They were debased, and they were exercising their communication that we're total at a loss here as to what to do. They seem to be at the end of their ability to deal with this.
And remember that the Persian Empire, as noted in verse 1 when we started out, stretched all the way to what modern day country of Pakistan on the east side, all the way over up against Greece on the west, and all the way down into Egypt on the south. So this, for the Jewish people to escape this, they would have had to have migrated long distances to get out of Persia altogether. So they know and realize that they're in a predicament that they're not going to be able to get out of unless something happens.
In the passage, it says they're fasting, they're mourning, they're weeping and wailing, they're putting on sackcloth and ashes. What are they not doing?
They're not going to God. We don't see them that they're crying out to God.
Nowhere in here does it say they reached out to God. Now, they may have been, but usually our text makes a point when someone, throughout the scriptures, when they repent and go back to God, then that's noted, because that's what God wants, is this love relationship. Nowhere in here do they ever says that they actually turn to God and call out to him. In the book of Judges, over and over again, we had equal problems, and they would periodically turn to God. So over in here, they're very sad, very distressed, but nowhere in here does it say that they turn to God. I find this very interesting. Even though they're far from God, God delivers them anyway. Even though they're far from God, they're in disobedience. They are a people. Remember, they were carried off in captivity because of disobedience in the first place, and these didn't go back to the nation Israel when the decree was allowed for them to go back. So they're in disobedience in a number of ways. Yet we're going to see God's hand upon them, even so. So they're fasting and mourning, but they're not praying. And what I think here is that they're brokenhearted. We should be brokenhearted, but we need to be brokenhearted because of our sin. We need to be brokenhearted not because of the evil circumstances we're in. That's bad enough. But what really should make us in sackcloth and ashes is when I look in the mirror and look at myself. Truly, it's the sin. That's what should get us to this situation. So next, starting in verse 4, it says this. We find out how Esther reacts. Then Esther's maidens and her eunuchs came and told her, and the queen writhed in great anguish, and she sent garments to clothe Mordecai, that he might remove his sackcloth from him, but he did not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach from the king's eunuchs, whom the king had appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. So Hathach went out to Mordecai to the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict which had been issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show Esther and inform her, and to order her to go in to the king to implore his favor and to plead with him for her people. Hathach came and related Mordecai's words to Esther. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. They related Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this." So Mordecai is very public because he expects to be killed. He expects to be killed. His people are going to be killed. The law of the Medes and Persians can't be changed. And he knows they have the power and the ability to do this. So he's very public. He'd been wailing through the streets, putting on sackcloth and ashes right up to the king's gate. It was in the city square. It was very public display of this. Esther sees him. She could see him from a distance, feels sorry for him. And so she sends this servant out, this eunuch, with a set of clothes. But Mordecai refuses. So Mordecai was mourning in turmoil, and he wasn't interested in a new set of clothes. New set of clothes not going to solve his problem here. So a new set of clothes would just been, as someone said, lipstick on a pig. You still got the problem here, and putting new clothes on not going to fix it. So that's Mordecai's situation. Are we ever in situations where a little bit of window dressing on the outside not going to fix it? We have a deeper problem that needs to be addressed, and a new set of clothes not going to fix it.
And during those times, whenever that happens, we should turn to God. That's really what we should do. When we've reached our end and there's nothing that we can do on our own in order to ensure that the situation is going to be rectified or remedied, then that's when we need to turn to God. Really, we should turn to God before that, but for sure, whenever you reach that point. And so it is a little bit mind-boggling that we don't see Mordecai doing this. But because of his refusal to put on new clothes, it does prompt Esther to dig a little bit deeper to find out what is the reason why Mordecai is in such distress.
Mordecai was in this huge distress because of the edict to kill all the Jewish people. It was an evil thing. He was very acutely aware of it. And so that's why he says, I don't need a new set of clothes. I'm not going to fix it. If we apply that to our lives today, then the evil, most of us don't have an edict to kill us from a king. What we have is an edict from God to be separate because of our sin. That's what separates us. That is a sentence of death. God told Adam, the day you sin, you will die. And so that's the death sentence that we're under. We're as a human race are under a sentence of death because of sin. And when we become aware of that, we should be equally undone. We should be equally wailing. I remember the Apostle Paul at the end of Romans chapter 7, he says, I'm tied to this body of sin and death. And he cries out, who will deliver me from this? He's wailing to God for this. A new set of clothes, not going to fix it. A new set of clothes of religion, putting on the outside of an old dead heart, not going to fix it. Just going through the outward motions of religion aren't going to fix it. We need a new heart. We've got a deeper problem. We've got a sentence of death. And just some pretty thing on the outside, not going to fix it. We need something that's going to fix the deeper problem. So same thing today. What we really need is to give our faith and trust in the Lord Jesus, and he'll take the sentence of death away, and he'll clean us up from the inside out, and then he'll give us a new set of clothes. That's the application for us today. Then we have this section here where Esther, apparently not aware of all the details, very insulated because she's up in the palace. So they're having to communicate by sending this eunuch, this servant, back and forth. So Steve, what I think of there is in our day, we have these people that society looks up to. The people that are rich and famous, the movie stars, the entertainers, the sports figures that are so wealthy, and we look at them and say, wow, that person's got everything. Look at all the money they have. They drive around in the nice cars, and they got the nice clothes, and they got enough money to do all they want. Well, Esther was in a position where she had all the money she could want. She ate fine food. She lived in a great house. What could she not have? She couldn't reach out to Mordecai, who was the person that raised her, that she loved, and put her arm around him. Because of all the fame and the money and the situation and the power, she couldn't live a normal life. Same thing with all these people today that we look up to, the sports people and the movie stars and all the wealthy people that are on the covers of the magazines and get all the glamour shots. They can't live normal lives. They're not happy people. In fact, if you really peel back the layers of all the press releases, they're really miserable down on the inside. They can't live normal life. They can't even, like Esther, couldn't reach out and hug the person she loved.
We see that over and over through history, that these famous people, they get to a point where they can't function in normal society. And so they do extravagant things of rent out all movie theaters only to themselves and their little entourage. That's another thing too. They kind of surround themselves with a small group of people so that they can do a normal thing like watch a movie, or they put out blackout curtains on their houses so that they can sleep during the daytime because they're up all night. And usually that leads to them taking drugs. We have that over and over again. And you're right. They have all this money and yet they can't function in a normal society.
Money will buy a bed, but it won't buy sleep. And it'll buy a house, but it won't buy a home. And it'll buy friends, but it won't buy love. And so money will not buy happiness. It'll buy you a lot of distractions to keep you from not thinking about how miserable you are, but it's not going to fix your problems. So in this exchange, Esther is sending this messenger out and getting him back. So they're having to talk via distance through this messenger. And at the end of verse 8, it says here that Mordecai gives this request to Esther. What does Mordecai want Esther to do?
He wants her to go to the king and seek his favor. He gives her the decree, what it says. He tells her the story of what's going to happen. And in her response, I think, get another glimpse of this king, how he is and his character. He chose Esther because of her beauty. That started out of Vashti, the former queen, not wanting to come whenever she was summoned. And we said, yeah, there seemed to be maybe something that was wrong there. What do we see here? In Esther's answer to Mordecai, she says, well, I haven't even been summoned to see the king in 30 days, a month. I haven't seen the king, and nobody can just go to the king. There's a law out there that if you just show up at the king's court without being summoned or invited, you're going to be killed. And so here's this king that chose Esther because of her beauty, but yet he hasn't even seen her for 30 days or gone to the court for 30 days. And now we might get a glimpse into why Vashti reacted the way she did. Maybe it was 30 days or even longer before she had been summoned, and now the king reaches out and says, oh, I want you to come. And so her answer is, no, I'm not going to come. But we see Esther go in a different direction. But it's another glimpse into this king, Ahasuerus, the type of character that he has.
He's not having what we would call a normal marriage. A normal marriage, the husband and wife would see each other, and if he really loved her that much, he'd want to see her. So there's all the trappings of the king and everything have really destroyed any kind of semblance of a family relationship here. So Mordecai says, go in and see the king and plead our case. She says, I can't do that. I'll be killed. It's against the law. So put ourselves in Esther's position. Not only was it a law that you just can't barge into the king's throne room without permission, and secondly, who would she be accusing? Haman, who was like number 2 in the kingdom, very rich and powerful man. This is the man that had just declared to kill the Jews. He had enough political scheming in him. He could have done something with her. She could be in a position to be under Haman's wrath as well. So this is a scary thing for a person that didn't grow up around all this political machinations and all the kingly drama. She's saying, I'd be accusing a high-level official and just going in and seeing the king. I don't know what his mood is. If I catch him on a day where he's angry about something, it could kill me just like that. Not a wise thing, according to Esther. She's in a bit of a spot here.
She would actually be accusing the king himself because it's his decree. Even though he didn't write it, he might not even know what's in it. You kind of get that feeling here that he doesn't really know what's in it, but it's his decree because his signet's on it. And it shows the problem of just giving over your power to somebody else. So that's the additional predicament that she's in. she be going into the king complaining about a direct decree that he's given?
Esther is afraid to go into the throne room to see an earthly king. The good news for the Christians is over in the book of Hebrews. It says that all Christians have the right and the authority to go directly into the throne room of God anytime we want. If we're a Christian, a child of the King, then we have the right and the authority to go directly into the throne room of God. We can interrupt the King's business, and he'll always have time to talk to his children. Isn't that wonderful? We don't have to be afraid of what mood he's in when we go in, because our King is impassible, is the technical word. He can't be changed. He's not having a bad day, and we have to worry about it. Moving on in the text, with verses 13 and 14 of chapter 4, it says Mordecai is finally showing some wisdom here about God. Mordecai gives Esther 3 key lessons. And this is really one of the key passages in the whole book. He says, don't think you're going to escape just because you're in a king's palace. And he says in verse 14, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from another place. And the third one is, who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. To me, those, Steve, are some of the key kind of hinge point of the whole book. He's telling Esther, look, don't think you're going to get out of this. This was a command for all Jews, and so destruction will come to you too. But who knows whether you were put into this position for such a time as this. I take great comfort in that, because Esther was in this really horrible, again, seemingly impossible circumstance, but she's in a key position to change something. We, in our generation, seem like all Christians are in a position where the world is just in a very evil place. And I will look every Christian in the eye and say, how do you know whether or not God has put you into a position like this for such a time as this? Great situations call for great people. And we may not feel, just like Esther, we may not feel like a great person, but we have a great God behind us. And Esther is going to do great things because of her God, not because of her. My Christian friend, how do you know whether God has not put you in a situation for such a time as this? So have faith in the God.
If Esther can't create an audience with the king from being a queen, then who else can? So while Haman might be the second in command or have a high place, she still is queen. She's not part of a harem. She has a queen. And so even though the king hasn't summoned her, doesn't mean that she doesn't have some ability by being queen to get a message to him and to reach out to him and to petition him from her status as being a queen.
So it just so happened that the Medo-Persian Empire had this battle that required the king to call these people together in chapter 1. And it just so happened that Vashti didn't want to come and see the king. And it just so happened that the king got mad at her because of that. And it just so happened that the advisors said that we should depose the queen, and it just so happened that he agreed with it, and it just so happened that Esther was made beautiful to win the contest, and it just so happened that the king's heart was turned to like her, and it just so happened that the keeper of the king's harem liked Esther, so that he gave her tips and tricks on how to win the king's heart, and it just so happened that Mordecai coached Esther to not reveal her Jewish heritage. And it just so happened that the casting of lots came up with enough time in between the decree and the actual death date of the Jews for all of this to happen. And it just so happens that God had his woman in the place to solve the problem before the problem was known. Well, none of that was just so happened. It was all there because God's hand of providence was on it. And again, he's moving the circumstances and working through human agency and through human actions to accomplish his will. And just as Mordecai told Esther, if you don't step up, God will do his purposes through another means. That is Mordecai showing his faith in God. Even though he doesn't mention God's name, he says the Jewish people will be delivered, whether or not you step up or not.
But he ends up encouraging her through that last sentence there in verse 14, when he says, and who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. So while he is saying, hey, if you don't step up, God's still going to bring about his purpose through another person, he's essentially telling her, you possibly have been put in this position in order to be able to bring about the purpose of God. And we should take encouragement in that there might become times when us as Christians meet a crossroads at some point where we can take action as a Christian in order to bring about God's purpose. And the question is, whenever we have our life reviewed before us and we see these things, I don't want to be in a position to see it called out that, you see that when this happened right here, Steve, this was a time whenever I wanted you to step forward and do something so that I could bring about a purpose, but you didn't do it. And so I had to work through somebody else. Same thing with Esther. If she doesn't take action, that would have been something to where God, when her life is being reviewed, is, Esther, I put you in that position of queen so that you could have interceded, and you didn't do it. And so I had to work through different purposes. I still brought about my purpose, and we can trust that God's going to do it. But Esther would have missed out on a reward if she hadn't stepped forward. And for us, it's the same thing. Who knows that on the times whenever God is impressing upon our heart in order to take action on something, we bypass a reward because we say, I don't think, God, that you really want me to do that. Well, maybe we should think twice about answering that way to God.
Some of those circumstances we get put into seem small to us. Some of them seem way impossible to us. How do you know whether God has not put you into a place for such a time as this? And so it may seem like a perilous time, may seem like an overwhelming time. God has put you for such a time as this. Mordecai had enough faith in God to know that God's going to deliver his people. God's going to deliver his people. He had made promises a very long time ago to Abraham, and he made a promise a very long time ago to David to work through those genealogies, through that ethnic heritage, to deliver his people. Mordecai knew God was not going to abandon his people. Deliverance will come from somewhere. Who knows whether God has not placed you for such a time as this? We live in very perilous times. We live in impossible times, but we have a God that can overcome impossible circumstances. Every Christian should realize this. Sometimes we convince ourselves, I'm not capable. That's what Mordecai and Esther were dealing with here. Esther seemed like there's nothing I can do. I can't go in to see the king. That's against the law. It's against the governmental rules. I haven't been called in. I'm just one person. Who am I? And Mordecai says that, no, you're in a position to change things. We can't always convince ourselves that I'm powerless. I am powerless, but I have a very powerful God, and he's put me into circumstances to do some things. We're fooling ourselves unless we realize, quote, the soul that sins shall die in Ezekiel 18:4. Reason to bring that up is we convince ourselves nothing's going to happen to me because I'm in this insulated situation. All those people out there, just like Esther, she could say, all those people out there in Susa in the town, they're the ones in turmoil. I'm here protected in the palace. Nothing's going to happen to me. Well, no, he's saying don't fool yourself that you're going to be insulated from this too. Destruction will come upon you as well. The sentence of death to all Jews had been declared. So therefore, Esther was under the sentence of death as well. Same thing with the human and sin. We may think, oh, sin's not going to bother me, maybe bother somebody else. The sentence of death is upon you. The soul that sins shall die. Therefore, take heed. We must go to the Lord because he's going to deliver. But if we sin, we're going to suffer the consequences. Just like Esther, if she doesn't do something, she's going to suffer the consequences. In the next two verses, starting in verse 15, says this: Then Esther told him to reply to Mordecai, Go, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way. And thus I will go to the king, which is not according to law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him. Esther asked for all the Jews to fast for her. No mention is made of prayer again, so they're still not where they need to be spiritually. Nevertheless, prayer is probably implied with the fasting. We would assume they'd be praying. Just doesn't say that. Either way, Esther gets to a point where she's willing to risk her life. She's willing to risk her life. This is a dangerous thing. The king of that entire edge of the planet and his most trusted official is the ones that's going to be involved here. This is very dangerous. She could indeed be killed. And she says, I have to do what God has put before me. If I perish, I perish. Each of us should ask ourselves whether we would continue in ministry even if it cost me my life. If it cost me my life, would I continue? Or am I going to compromise and try to fall back into safety? We get to a point where we have to trust God and say, if I perish, I perish. I'm moving forward with what God has before me to do.
And I'm happy to see that Esther has made this decision. She's moving forward, and she's saying, if I get killed because of this, so be it. We again don't see God mentioned here, but we just get this sense that she is willing to offer her life for all of her people, and that she's trusting that God is going to work something out here.
We have here at the end of chapter 4, we have Esther in a bit of a pickle. She's having to do a very risky thing, go before a very powerful king to accuse a very powerful man of a crime. And this is a very scary thing for a beautiful young girl. So we're going to see how she reacts next time as we reason through the Bible.
Thank you for watching and listening. May God bless you.